In this news roundup of a week for Friday, December the 5th, 2025, Trump's America has finally launched its national security strategy, and it says the astonishing parts out loud in ways that should have Europeans demanding answers, but won't. The latest feeble stab at pretending to negotiate peace in Ukraine has kind of puttered to an exhausted stop, so what's next? Europe does once again what Donald Trump hates the most, namely fining American tech and social media companies. In this case, it's Elon Musk's Twitter. Plus, I reflect on a true, formerly unsung hero. So, let's jump straight in. Having observed the behaviour of the Trump administration in the world over the course of 2025, we could have put together the bullet points of how it sees the world in terms of its national security. On this channel, I've talked about America's interest in interfering in European countries, actively promoting hard-right populist MAGA-friendly parties in a way that should be provoking outrage for its interference in others' affairs. Also, we've talked about Trump's desire to completely control what happens in the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, and his approach to Asia, pushing Southeast Asian countries to shun their involvement with the biggest neighbour, China, and to dissuade China from ever invading Taiwan, since that would interfere with American interests, but preferably to get Japan and South Korea and Taiwan itself to foot the bill for that. Otherwise, to downgrade China as an existential military threat. Well, the United States has just published its long-awaited National Security Strategy, the document where it officially says how it sees the world and what its priorities are for what it's trying to achieve. And it's pretty much all there in black and white. So let's start with Europe because, well, I live in Europe. The Trump administration sees itself in the business of, quote, promoting European greatness, which sounds lovely if you're not aware of the special meaning of that term in the MAGA lexicon. Here it minces no words. The Europeans have gotten in the way of solving the war in Ukraine, i.e. by not letting Trump simply force Ukraine's defeat on Russia's terms. But also, their countries are facing civilizational erasure. European countries are allowing too much immigration, are censoring free speech, suppressing the political opposition, by which they mean any policies that make life harder for said far-right extremist parties, have cratering birth rates, loss of national identities and self-confidence. As such, it is far from obvious whether certain European countries will have economies and militaries strong enough to remain reliable allies. Now there's the thing. Hands up who wants to be lectured by Trump's America about who is or who is not a reliable ally. The growing influence of patriotic European parties indeed give cause for great optimism. Our goal should be to help Europe correct its current trajectory. Gee, you're going to help us even if we don't want help. What do we do to deserve it? No, really, what? We want to work with aligned countries that want to restore their former greatness. They finish the European section by saying this: our broad policy for Europe should prioritise, and then amongst the bullet points that follow, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. So there you go, subverting European nations' democracies, seeking to get the so-called allies with whom they collaborate replaced by hard right mini-Trumps. That section should have European countries calling in their respective US ambassadors for a formal protest. But it won't, because then the pretense would be over. So what does the Trump administration have to say about Russia, you might ask? Well, of course, nothing, except that those silly Europeans demonstrate their lack of self-confidence in considering Russia an existential threat, while also not giving them exactly what they want in Ukraine. Now, of course, interfering in Europe is just a hobby for Trump. Dominating the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, that's what he cares the most about. The United States must be preeminent in the Western Hemisphere as a condition of our security and prosperity, a condition that allows us to assert ourselves confidently where and when we need to in the region. Indeed, just yesterday, America asserted itself confidently again against 4 people in a boat in the Caribbean Sea, killing all of them. So expect to see a bit more of that, but mostly it's about trade. America first, it turns out, means that the United States wants everyone in the world, whether they're inclined to or not, to buy American goods. In the Western Hemisphere and everywhere in the world, the United States should make clear that American goods, services and technologies are a far better buy in the long run, because they are higher quality and do not come with the same kind of strings as other countries' assistance. Unless, of course, the United States has an interest in turning off that service and support for those products, in which case, yeah, too bad. The choice all countries should face is whether they want to live in an American-led world of sovereign countries and free economies, or in a parallel one in which they are influenced by countries on the other side of the world. Now, you must wonder if they actually regret dismantling the Voice of America, which used to have 100 million Spanish-speaking listeners across South America, to hear that sort of message. But then, why give those people the choice anyway? So it adds this: the terms of our agreements, especially with those countries that depend on us most, and therefore over which we have the most leverage, must be sole source contracts for our companies. Because nothing says free economies than a large country using its leverage over you to demand that you buy only its goods. Now, when it comes to Asia, it downgrades the talks of China as the existential military threat, but it's clear it will push countries in the region to shun its influence, while largely doing so at their own expense. Then there's Taiwan. It says its interest in Taiwan is twofold. One, because of Taiwan's dominance of semiconductor production, which is a factor the US has been trying to mitigate for some time by getting it to bring all of those factories to American soil. But number two won't change, even if that happened. Given that 1/3 of global shipping passes annually through the South China Sea, this has major implications for the US economy. Hence deterring a conflict over Taiwan, ideally by preserving military overmatch, is a priority. Now, that last sentence seemed drafted and passed in denial of reality. China's military is growing much faster than America's, and it's adding capacity more cheaply as well, but apparently equal or close enough to equal quality. Now, we might have a longer discussion about the various weaknesses that there likely are in the Chinese military. They're not battle-tested, they have been routinely purged of senior generals, and so on and so on. Those are factors. But the confidence in the US side on military power, just like on the quality of its goods and services, seems somewhat complacent and underestimating the progress by their rival. But what about Africa, you might ask? Well, Africa gets a couple of paragraphs right at the end, neatly summarised by 2 messages. One, forget about aid from us in the future to feed your starving and to treat your ill. But hello, I see you have natural resources. We'll have some of those. Now, you might think that's overly cynical. After all, you might say, didn't President Trump just this week preside over a historic peace deal between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo? The Washington Accords, as he handily named them. The 208th war that Trump has single-handedly ended, like an orange Superman flying across the world, bringing truth, justice, and the American way, by which we mean extortion with tariffs. Well, while the peace might not be that optimistic, given the tension between the presidents and the misgivings they'd voiced before the signing took place, one part, the most important part, was where each country signed, yes, bilateral deals with the United States to give it access to critical minerals. We'll be involved with sending some of our biggest and greatest companies over to these 2 countries, and we're going to take out some of the rare earth. Everybody is going to make a lot of money. Everybody named Trump, that is, and everyone whose business is an ally of Trump. So that's a reminder of what this looks like in practice. Now, after all of that, the national security strategy concludes with this sentence that almost made me snort coffee out of my nose, which is never something that you want. What differentiates America from the rest of the world? Our openness, transparency, trustworthiness, commitment to freedom and innovation and free market capitalism will continue to make us the global partner of first choice, or else. Oh, and also our insistence that President Trump must be at the centre of all world events and win a Nobel Peace Prize. Which brings us to the latest episode in the long-running series, Will They, Won't They Do a Peace in Ukraine? When I covered this before, I observed that there was nothing in the so-called US peace proposals that didn't look like it hadn't been drafted by Moscow, bar a couple of short bullet points. Since even that, unacceptable to Ukraine as it was, hadn't been given unqualified agreement by Vladimir Putin, it seemed odd that everyone was suddenly saying peace was now closer than it'd ever been, and there was real momentum, and it must be serious because Trump sent in Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, so there must be some serious money to be made or something. And they met this week and apparently talked about it all for 5 hours, at the end of which they were left with a computer says no type outcome, which is kind of what we would have predicted. Vladimir Putin says that Ukraine must withdraw from the part of Donbass that his army hasn't been able to conquer, or else he'll try really, really hard next time and conquer it anyway. Which is exactly what he was saying before. Indeed, 5 hours appears to have been too short a time to wring any sort of concession out of him. And that's because it's not about peace, obviously. It's about Putin giving the illusion of an ongoing process to keep holding Trump off ratcheting up sanctions against the buyers of Russian oil and gas. And once again, I've been hearing BBC commentators and others speculating that given the lack of progress, this must mean it's likely that Donald Trump will end up walking away from both sides. And once again, I have to roll my eyes at that, because it is patently obvious that walking away, no longer being the centre of attention, is the one thing Trump cannot do. I mean, look, he might do it performatively. I remember when I was a kid, very small kid, and I was particularly irked about some parental injustice or another, and I stormed out of a house declaring, "Fine, I'm running away from home then." I then somewhat undermined the power of my position by adding the words, "for an hour." Now that's the sort of walking away that Trump might just about be capable of, driven by pretty much the same mental age, one might suggest. Ultimately, Trump's only play is to end the Ukraine war by forcing Ukraine to accede to Moscow's terms. That's it. That's his whole strategy. The Europeans know this, but they don't say it publicly because they keep clinging to the belief that maybe they can talk Trump round, even though it's patently obvious, borne out by repeated evidence over and over again. And this week we can say that we know for a fact that they know this, because we got a leaked transcript from the conference call of Europeans and Ukrainians that took place on Monday. That reached the hands of the German news outlet Der Spiegel yesterday. French President Macron reportedly said there is a possibility that the US will betray Ukraine on the issue of territory without clarity on security guarantees. Do you think? German Chancellor Friedrich Merz warned Zelensky he had to be extremely careful in the coming days. They are playing games, both with you and with us. Now, is this a big revelation? No. It's just confirmation of what I've been assuming here from the start. The Europeans know full well the situation. They're just not saying in public what they know. And we still had today Mark Rutte, the Secretary-General of NATO, the man who famously called Donald Trump Daddy, saying still, Trump is the only person who can break the Russia-Ukraine deadlock. Still holding out hope that if you can pretend a little bit longer and a little bit harder, maybe it will make Trump blink and do something. However accidentally that something might be done, that will turn out to be beneficial. The same forlorn hope that is behind Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha declaring that Vladimir Putin should stop wasting the world's time and negotiate for peace for real. Again, one of those statements that is not intended for the person that it is allegedly aimed at, allegedly to Putin, but really for Trump. Yes, it's Putin who is standing between you, Donald Trump, and the Nobel Peace Prize. But Trump has no strategy for dealing with Putin, so good luck with that. Meanwhile, India's Narendra Modi has been showing just how cowed he is by Trump's insistence that India cuts off buying Russian oil or anything from Russia by hosting President Putin for a 2-day visit to India. And those two crazy kids have been signing a number of deals, exactly in the way President Trump would, by his own words, like to, if only he could get the pesky Ukrainian thing out of the way. If only the Europeans would fall into line and stop supporting the actual victim of an invasion. Mind you, he may be more exercised today, with the news that, contrary to his instructions, the Europeans have gone ahead and fined Elon Musk's Twitter €120 million as the first social media company to be hit by the Digital Services Act. This, the outcome of a case that was opened back almost 2 years ago. The Digital Services Act is one of those pieces of legislation that President Trump was trying to get the EU to drop altogether in return for slightly less egregious tariffs. As far as Trump is concerned, any sort of regulation on American tech businesses, at least if it goes beyond what the US itself does, assuming it does anything at all these days, is unfair, discriminatory, and to be punished aggressively. Now, at the time of shooting this video, Trump himself hadn't reacted yet, but J.D. Vance commented before the ruling, and he said that the EU should not be, quote, attacking American companies over garbage. Secretary of State Marco Rubio weighed in with, the European Commission's $140 million fine isn't just an attack on X, it's an attack on all American tech platforms and the American people by foreign governments. The days of censoring Americans online are over. Oozing with self-righteousness. And yet one has to note that the US expects European companies to abide by American law when they operate on its soil. And indeed, so does everyone else around the world. But, you know, one rule for everyone else around the world and another for America. Almost beyond parody, Brendan Carr, the chair of the Federal Communications Commission, last seen urging American comedians to be taken off the air for wrong speech, well, he also waded in. To be fair, at least he didn't parrot the free speech line, which would have been particularly galling coming from him. Instead, he said this: once again, Europe is fining a successful US tech company for being a successful US tech company. And that seems fair enough, because after all, the more they fine US tech companies, the less money those companies will have to donate to Donald Trump's presidential library. The company was actually fined for breaching obligations around transparency, not censorship, not free speech. It was focused on such issues as the failure by the company to give researchers access to Twitter's publicly accessible data, shortcomings in the ads repository, and what was said to be deceptive design in relation to the blue check marks. Not massive issues, hence the fine was actually on the low side, given that the rules could result in a fine of up to 6% of their annual global turnover. The Commission digital chief, Henna Virkunen, was asked by Politico how she felt about whatever response might come from the White House, given that the journalists are playing up to the projection that rules count for nothing in the face of Donald Trump's wrath. Was she, they said, afraid of America's reaction? No, she said, which was possibly the most succinct thing that's ever come out of the European Union. And good for her, although let's see how it holds out under pressure. The EU has another probe against Musk's Twitter about whether the social media platform is meeting the rules in how it does or doesn't seek to counter the spread of illegal content in the European bloc. Now, that's the one that will set the MAGA red hats off. Also worth noting that Brussels opened a new antitrust investigation this week on the owner of Facebook and Instagram, Meta, because of its policy on allowing AI companies to access WhatsApp data. So there's plenty there to keep the Americans furious at the old world over the coming year. Alright, no replies to comments this week, but I wanted to quickly highlight two stories. One of them very inspiring, one of them kind of funny. To those of us who were paying attention to the Chinese crackdown on students in Tiananmen Square back in 1989, the big visual moment, of course, was the remarkable courage of the citizen who stood in front of a column of tanks in outrage that they should move against their own people. But not all heroes get their moment on world television. This week, there was a leak of a video of a 6-hour court-martial of the Chinese general Xu Qinxiong from 1990 for having refused to obey the Communist Party's orders to break up the student protests with violence. He was in charge of the elite 38th Group Army. He told his superiors the protests were a mass political movement. They should be responded to by political means, not military. When it became clear the leadership was going to go ahead anyway, he told them to find someone else to do it. And he was the only general to refuse those orders. Now look, it's one thing to be someone in the public eye, to be making a brave stand of some sort, knowing that it will get some attention, that whatever consequences may follow, you at least had a platform that might make some difference. But to refuse the order of your bosses, when all your peers are complying and acting, knowing that you have no support, knowing the consequences will be severe, knowing that maybe nobody will ever know, or certainly in the long run care, about what you did. That takes real strength of character, real commitment to a sense of personal values, and real courage. In a world of small men with no values except for self-interest, I would want to praise and honour people like Xu Qinxiong, who stood up for the principle that the People's Army should not fire on its own people. General Xu was jailed for 5 years, then sent to live in internal exile under house arrest until he died in 2021, 31 years later. Unlike this guy, who I must admit came into my mind when I saw this story. You've heard the phrase drunk as a skunk? Well, not a skunk, but a raccoon who broke into a liquor store, went on a wild binge drinking session, staggered to the bathrooms where he duly passed out. When I heard the story, I could only wonder if this had once been the pet raccoon of one Pete Hegseth, and the raccoon had resorted to drowning his sorrows in the time-honoured fashion, as he'd seen his owner do so many times over the years. 'Cause yes, the news could feel a bit wearing at times. Nevertheless, be like General Xu, firm in the face of pressure. Don't be like the drunken skunk, or even the charmingly flattened raccoon. Alright, my thanks as always to the good people who support this channel via Patreon, without whom these videos wouldn't be possible. That's all for now. Have a great weekend.